The National Electrical Code, specifically Article 300.22 c, mandates the removal of abandoned cables and conductors. These must either be removed entirely or cut back and terminated at junction boxes or other accessible locations within the ceiling space. This requirement applies broadly to ceiling spaces. There is an exception to this rule. Exception number 1 states that abandoned cables and conductors may be left in place in a ceiling space. This is permitted where the space is dedicated for environmental air handling and is not accessible to unqualified persons. To properly understand this exception, it's important to define a few key terms. Firstly, what constitutes a ceiling space? Generally, this refers to the area above a finished ceiling, such as the drop ceiling, and below the structural floor above. This space often houses various building systems, including electrical wiring, communication cables, and HVAC ductwork. Secondly, what does environmental air handling mean? This refers to spaces specifically designed to circulate air for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, often referred to as a plenum. These spaces are used to distribute conditioned air throughout the building. Thirdly, what defines an unqualified person? An unqualified person is someone who lacks the necessary training, knowledge, and experience to safely work on or around electrical equipment. This would typically include building occupants, cleaning staff, or maintenance personnel who are not licensed electricians or otherwise qualified electrical workers. Considering these definitions, the exception allows abandoned cables to remain in place only under very specific conditions. The ceiling space must be solely dedicated to environmental air handling. It must also be inaccessible to unqualified persons. The rationale behind this exception is that if the space is not accessible to unqualified personnel, the risk of accidental contact with or damage to the abandoned cables is minimized. However, this exception has limitations. Drop ceilings are typically accessible to unqualified persons for various reasons. These reasons include maintenance, repairs, and cleaning purposes. The tiles can easily be removed, providing access to the space above. Therefore, the exception does not generally apply to drop ceilings with return air duct systems. In the case of drop ceilings, even if they are used for environmental air handling, the accessibility to unqualified persons negates the exception. As a result, abandoned cables must be removed or terminated properly. It is crucial to note that the definition of abandoned cable is also important. An abandoned cable is a cable that is not terminated at equipment other than a connecting block and not identified for future use with a tag. Such cables must be removed. The National Electrical Code aims to minimize fire hazards and electrical shock risks. Leaving abandoned cables in ceiling spaces can contribute to these risks for several reasons. Firstly, abandoned cables can become a fire hazard. Over time, the insulation on these cables can degrade, creating a potential ignition source. If a fault occurs, the cable could overheat and start a fire, especially in a plenum space where combustible materials may be present. Secondly, abandoned cables can pose an electrical shock hazard. Although the cables are no longer in use, they may still be energized or become energized due to contact with other live conductors. If someone accidentally touches an abandoned cable, they could receive an electrical shock. Thirdly, abandoned cables can obstruct access to other equipment in the ceiling space. This can make it difficult to perform maintenance or repairs on other systems. It can also create a tripping hazard for workers who need to access the space. Fourthly, abandoned cables can create confusion and make it difficult to identify active cables. This can lead to errors during troubleshooting or future electrical work. To ensure compliance with the National Electrical Code and to mitigate the risks associated with abandoned cables, it is essential to follow these guidelines. Firstly, identify all abandoned cables in the ceiling space. This may require a thorough inspection of the wiring and cable infrastructure. Secondly, remove all abandoned cables or cut them back and terminate them at accessible locations such as junction boxes. This will eliminate the risk of fire, electrical shock, and obstruction. Thirdly, properly label all active cables to avoid confusion. This will help to ensure that future electrical work is performed safely and accurately. Fourthly, implement a system for managing cables in the ceiling space. This may involve using cable trays, hangers, or other supports to keep the cables organized and prevent them from becoming tangled or damaged. Fifthly, conduct regular inspections of the ceiling space to identify any new abandoned cables or other potential hazards. This will help to ensure that the space remains safe and compliant with the National Electrical Code. In conclusion, the requirement to remove abandoned cables within a ceiling space applies even if it is used for environmental air or includes spaces above drop ceilings with a return air duct system. While the National Electrical Code does provide an exception for spaces dedicated to environmental air handling that are not accessible to unqualified persons, this exception typically does not apply to drop ceilings. The accessibility of drop ceilings to unqualified persons for maintenance or cleaning purposes negates the exception, necessitating the removal or proper termination of abandoned cables to ensure safety and code compliance.